And so our next speaker, Mr. Gavin Emerson, has been a clinical hypnotherapist with over 25 years of experience. In the late 90s, he was the vice principal of the LSCCH, and at that time helped to develop its training programs in clinical and medical hypnosis. He then spent considerable time working in legal and medical personal injury cases involving PTSD. Mr. Emerson went on to develop innovative training programs in brief strategic therapy that was CPD approved by both the Royal Colleges of Psychiatrists and Nursing. He was instrumental in developing and delivering the practical content for the first diploma in higher education and Bachelor of Science in Clinical Hypnosis in the UK. Mr. Emerson more recently set up the dental hypnosis course at UCL Eastman's Dental Institute. Over the past 10 years, he has also transferred his therapeutic skills into helping others manage the significant emotional impact of interactional conflict and parental disputes. In a time when people are struggling not only to have compassion for others, but more detrimentally any compassion for themselves, Mr. Emerson wishes to explore the importance of encouraging greater empathy and compassion in adapting to the pandemic and beyond. The floor is yours, Mr. Emerson.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the very, very kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to say, I'm delighted to be speaking to all of you today at the inaugural conference in clinical hypnosis. I've really enjoyed listening to the other speakers. I've learned a lot from them. And I'm also delighted to be speaking to friends in the world of hypnosis and those who have a genuine interest in the subject. I'm particularly interested and excited to be talking about two of my favourite subjects, which are clinical hypnosis and compassion, which hopefully I'll get across in this presentation. Okay, but first of all, just a reflection, and many speakers have expressed themselves much more eloquently than me, but just to acknowledge the significant devastation that the pandemic has caused. Bereavement, PTSD, long COVID, mental health problems for children, the list goes on and on. Now, clearly, we've all been touched by the pandemic, and for many of us, our lives have been changed inextricably. So what I'd like to do is to ask two questions. I suppose the first question is compassion important in response to the pandemic? And the second question I'd like to ask is, well, if it is, could we be utilising it more within a clinical hypnosis framework? Now, I want to acknowledge that obviously as clinical hypnotherapists and healthcare professionals, we are compassionate by nature. But I also want to be quite transparent about myself. Now, for the many years that I've trained hypnotherapists from a broad variety of backgrounds, I almost assumed compassion was important. It was a part of our work. It was a part of the techniques we did. I didn't necessarily see it as a particular approach to dealing with psychological suffering. That was until I began to work in the field of conflict, and particularly the emotional impact of conflict on systems of people. So what I'd like to do is just to move to the first slide, to share my screen. This one. Okay, now, give me 1 second. That's the one. Okay, so what I'd like to do first of all is to give you a basic definition of compassion. Now, I'm well aware that many of you will know more about compassion perhaps in your lives than I do. So this is a useful working definition for this presentation. And when we're looking at the psychological aspects, this is put forward by Professor Paul Gilbert, clinical psychologist. He defines compassion as the sensitivity, which obviously relates in some way to empathy, to suffering in self and others, with a commitment or intent to try and alleviate and prevent it. Now, I'm going to speak more about the commitment or intent to try and alleviate it than I am the sensitivity, simply because if you can increase your compassionate intent, you tend to naturally increase your sensitivity that we will come back to in the presentation. Now, many of you who are familiar with compassion will recognize it has a flow. It's suggested it flows in three directions, towards others, from others towards ourselves, and towards ourselves. It's also suggested that whenever there's a blockage in that flow of compassion, sooner or later it can begin to impede the general flow of compassion in the other dimensions. Another way of looking at that diagram is just to simply think about our positive connections with others and ourselves. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about first of all, and you know, this is in a roundabout way of why compassion is so important. Let's talk about what happens when compassion is blocked or breaks down between people, or if for one reason or another we have the sense to be compassionate, but for one reason or another we ignore that sense. Okay, when compassion is blocked, it tends to influence how we see and relate to others. It even influences how we see ourselves. It fundamentally reduces our connection to others. In that context, within groups of people, people tend to not feel valued. They tend not to feel appreciated. They tend to feel that they're irrelevant. And therefore, it creates a sense of uncertainty or a sense of threat within those systems of people. Now, within that context, people begin to experience significant levels of anxiety and worry, and frequently will misunderstand other people's emotions. They will misattribute meanings and behavior, quite simply based upon how they're feeling. Frequently, to justify how people are seeing other people, they begin to find faults in them. They begin to blame, they begin to criticize, all in an attempt to try and often shame them to changing in some way that's more agreeable to that particular person or individual. Now, what's really important to understand, which is a major theme of this talk, is that when compassion is missing, it reduces collaboration. It reduces adaptability between people. They're unable to communicate on an effective level. Ultimately, if compassion continues to be missing, it tends to result in disputes and conflict, all of which can significantly impact people's mental health, and particularly if there are children involved. Now, obviously an individual is different to a group of people, but if we view an individual as a system, there are some similarities. Now, when compassion is missing towards ourselves or blocked, it tends to very much influence how we see and relate to ourselves. It tends to reduce our general level of connection. It creates, again, an internal sense of uncertainty and threat because we see ourselves so much more harshly. We tend to misunderstand our internal emotional experiences. We tend to think they're wrong. We tend also to find fault in ourselves. We tend to self-criticize. And ultimately, more globally, we may begin to self-shame. Now, all of this, again, reduces our adaptability to difficult, challenging life experiences, which ultimately result in often internal conflict and mental health issues. Now, I think it's very, very important to acknowledge that a consistent factor involved in a whole range of mental health issues is self-criticism and self-shame with low self-compassion, because it's suggested that what it does is it triggers the same amygdala limbic pathways as if actually someone was being threatening or criticizing you to your face. Okay, so there's a big problem if compassion is missing. So where does compassion come from? Now, I'm going to talk about this from an evolutionary perspective. Now, whether or not you believe in evolution, and some people don't, and that's okay, we're going to come to the same point, the same value in compassion. Now, it's suggested that compassion originated from our attachment systems. Obviously, being loved and cared for by our parents massively, significantly affected our ability to survive as a species, particularly due to our long brain gestation period. But at some point in our evolution, we recognized there was a significant benefit in living in larger groups, whether it's to find food, whether it's to find shelter, whether it's to find safety, or even to reproduce. Now, being cared for and caring for others within a group massively contributed to our abilities to communicate with one another, to share information, to learn from one another, to understand each other's experiences. But even beyond that, being compassionate and caring about others within a group increases its integral sense of safety. And this is fundamental to understand, is that it's the very fact that we created a sense of safety within our groups that enabled us then to adapt successfully to the multitude of crises we've had to face as a human species. Because quite simply, by creating an integral sense of safety within the group, it provokes more of an outward mindset, a mindset where individuals focus on the whole of the group, a shift from me to we, you might say. By focusing on other members of the group, it also meant that individual members actually became more courageous. It increased their courage to face challenges, which I think we've all acknowledged with those working in a healthcare setting and on the front line of the pandemic. So it not only increased our sense of courage to step forward and go beyond our own individual fears, but it's also suggested that part of that benefit was that it enhanced our psychological and physiological healing in order that we could rebuild as quickly as possible after the particular crisis had ended. Okay, so some general benefits of compassion. Now, to be quite honest with you, look, over 30 years now, there have been consistent research projects, and there are over 1,000 research papers produced on compassion. And I'll be honest, I haven't read them all. But here are just some that I think might be useful to you to read in your own time. But what I want to look at specifically are benefits that perhaps will relate to us as hypnotherapists and individuals. Now, first of all, receiving compassion and giving compassion. I'm going to speak about those together, but there are slightly different benefits. Now, what we understand about receiving compassion is that it stimulates parasympathetic dominance in our vagus response. And that's interesting to us as hypnotherapists. So it helps to relax people and to reduce stress and anxiety. But what's also interesting, compassion, receiving it and giving it, seems to increase the production of oxytocin and vasopressin, which are neurotransmitters that are very, very important with regards to our connection and our sense of safety and trust with others. Now, interestingly enough, giving compassionate or being compassionate has the same benefits to receiving compassion from other people, but to a greater degree. It's suggested that giving compassion or being compassionate actually causes you to release endorphins. Now, that's particularly important to us as therapists because it buffers us against depressed states and low moods. It's also suggested that it increases the production of dopamine. Now, that's particularly important when you're dealing with problems such as empathetic burnout. It's suggested that dopamine depletion is a major factor. Now, other benefits is that compassion is that it's now recognized to improve our immune functioning, our healing, and even our longevity. Now, for those of you who are single, it also says that, and after the pandemic, it's also said to improve your attraction, your level of attraction. But I suppose that's only if you're being compassionate in the first place rather than you're looking for a partner. Okay, so moving on to self-compassion, and this is particularly interesting, I think, that Neff suggests that self-compassion stimulates the same neurological and physiological pathways as receiving and giving compassion. Now, there's lots of research that suggests that compassion or self-compassion buffers us from stress and the impact of stressful experiences and reduces depression. But what I think is really interesting as well is that it's also being suggested now that compassion is the fundamental context to our psychological functioning that enables us to integrate different parts of our experiences. And that's particularly interesting to us as therapists who might use, for example, part therapy. Now, there's some recent research as well, which is particularly interesting, relating to PTSD. And they looked at war veterans returning from Afghanistan. And basically, what they recognized was it wasn't so much the magnitude of the traumatic experience that was the best gauge of whether the person would develop post-traumatic stress or not. What they recognized was, in fact, it was the level of self-compassion, which I think is a really interesting idea for those of you who work within the field of post-traumatic stress. Okay, so looking at the benefits, well, first of all, look, ideas for layering a compassionate focus into clinical hypnosis. What I would say, first of all, is don't give up your day job. And I generally mean layering compassion into a clinical hypnosis focus. Now, there was once the view that compassion and empathy were fixed traits, but now we recognize, due to neuroplasticity, that our brain is continuing to evolve and learn throughout our lives. But in particular, it evolves around what we hold as important. In the same way, when you first started to study clinical hypnosis, you probably have started to see trances everywhere. And when you started to study maybe specialized patterns of communication, you started to hear different types of suggestions everywhere used within people's language. So what we recognize is, just by holding the concept of compassion and self-compassion as being extremely important to our psychological welfare, it mobilizes our brain to increase its sensitivity in those areas, which is also said to increase our sensitivity or compassionate or empathetic sensitivity and awareness. So a couple of ideas as to how you could integrate compassion into your work, particularly in relation to the patients we may see as a result of suffering related to the pandemic. Now, first of all, just a tip for ourselves working virtually, and I know you've just had a talk on this, but what I found as a personal reflection, that when I started to work virtually, I felt disconnected, as many of the speakers would have said. But what I recognize perhaps is that this is due to an empathetic deficit, that when we're looking at a screen, our mirror neurons just aren't firing in the same way. So there are quite simple exercises that you can do as a therapist to mobilize your empathetic awareness and your compassionate skills for a few moments before you see each client, to reduce that sense of disconnection, which ultimately benefits you and is likely to benefit your relationship with the client and hopefully the therapeutic outcome. Now, what's very, very important when we're speaking to our clients is to highlight the benefits of compassion, first of all, to identify what we could say the qualities of compassion are. Now, there are many qualities, and these are just a couple of main ones that I think are important to discuss. Now, first of all, I would say wisdom. Now, therapists by nature are wise people because you understand the nature of suffering, but your patients or clients often do not. And what I mean by wisdom is for you to help the patient to realize that, look, you don't choose suffering. You don't choose your genetics. You don't choose to be born. You don't choose your brain structure that makes us all susceptible to mental health problems. You don't choose your upsetting emotions. You don't choose your fears. And you don't choose your suffering. And therefore, it's not your fault. Now, this is a fundamental message to get across to clients to begin to address self-criticism and shame that we'll come back to within a hypnotic framework. The next one is courage. Now, for some people, they perceive compassion as being soft or weak or passive. But actually, compassion, when you think about it, is the complete opposite. It's the sensitivity to suffering, the willingness to go towards it, whether it's in yourself or others. And it takes, as we all know, massive amounts of courage to go towards your own suffering. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at the systems or groups of people that deal with the most adverse situations, they tend to have the highest levels of integral compassion for one another. Now, the concept of courage is obviously very, very important for overcoming and reducing avoidance. The next one I want to talk about is warmth, and whatever emotional warmth means to you. It could be being kind, friendly, open, non-judgmental, playful. But what seems to be very, very important when we're working with clients is that to actually trigger the physiological experience of warmth. So they don't just have a cognitive experience, a behavioral experience, they have an emotional experience. Now, it's suggested that sense of warmth that is sort of familiar to many of us who do hypnotherapy is suggested to indicate either release of endorphins or oxytocin. And so that tends to happen quite spontaneously in various inductions and deepeners. Now, with regards to the hypnotherapeutic state, now, using compassion to induce hypnosis, interestingly enough, just by talking about compassion tends to induce hypnotic responses. It tends to get people to reflect back on when they've experienced compassion. But you can naturally include compassionate memories of receiving compassion or giving compassion to others within those induction procedures. But a word of caution, not everyone has a positive response to ideas of compassion. Some people have not had compassionate experiences, particularly in their upbringing, and therefore it may trigger off fears. But in those particular clients, if we're using a compassionate approach, we can utilize those fears to explore the state dependentness of their symptoms or the origins of those experiences. So we can use it as a way of accessing. Now, the bulk of hypnotherapeutic work using compassion is really going to involve utilizing imagery in a highly focused state of mind to learn that we're all familiar with, and using symbolic imagery that the client represents those compassionate qualities that are important to them, whether it's wisdom, courage, emotional warmth, or all the other qualities, and then applying it to themselves in their own particular distress or problems, or in relation to their interaction with other people, and therefore giving the client a very practical learning experience of how to use compassion in relation to their own suffering and sense of disconnection. Okay, to summarize some takeaway messages. Now, this is so important. Compassion is an evolved psychological resource that most people don't realize it has such potential, which is why I'm sharing this presentation with you today. It enables us to successfully adapt in crisis, and therefore it's so integral to encourage compassion in our relationship to people within the pandemic and in other people within our lives who are going through the same experience. It connects us all through caring and being cared for with a whole host of physiological and psychological benefits. Now, a compassionate focus can be readily layered into clinical hypnosis framework to reduce psychological suffering, enhance mental states and physical well-being, and increase our sense of connection to both others and ourselves, and remembering a major dynamic in the psychological problems we deal with as hypnotherapists is people feel disconnected as a result of their symptomology, disconnected from themselves, disconnected from others. Now, on a final note, those of you who are familiar with post-traumatic stress may be familiar with the concept of post-traumatic growth. Now, post-traumatic growth is a phenomena that you occasionally encounter where people's lives have been so shattered, so smashed to pieces, that it causes a fundamental reevaluation as to who they are, what's important to them, their connections, how important those connections are. And for post-traumatic growth, it takes massive amounts of compassion. Now, obviously, we are still in the pandemic, and hopefully in the future, we will move into a phase of post-crisis growth. And to do our part in that, it's vital that we're not only compassionate to our patients or clients, but to our family, our friends, colleagues, even the people who perhaps irritate us a bit from time to time. That's the end of this presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. I think it was a very important topic, and it has stimulated a lot of discussion in the chat box. So I think, yeah, a lot of very important notes here. I just want to mention a few. There was, it started off with a discussion regarding compassion and whether it is innate or it can be nurtured. So there was very interesting feedback from many of our participants, and I think I can conclude from their discussion that it is both. Would you like to weigh in on that?
We have a genetic capacity for compassion and empathy, but when you look at the research, the majority of people do not utilize that potential. Therefore, we can continuously learn to optimize and increase our levels of compassion and empathy. And to be quite frank, even if you are a compassionate person, it would take a lifetime to optimize it. So it's an ongoing process.
And I think another point made was, given that it's the time of COVID, it's rather difficult because there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame games. So as much as you want to be compassionate, there's a lot of issues being brought about by the pandemic itself.
I think it's a very, very important, it's a very, very important question, and a really good question. Look, at the end of the day, people cannot take accountability unless they feel safe. So if people are going to blame one another, first of all, it actually damages what you're trying to achieve. When people blame, it doesn't really express how you're feeling. In fact, it avoids telling the person how you're feeling because it's just simply threatening to them. So all I would say is that, you can deal with blame in different ways. You can meet it head for head, or you can have the insight to know that when someone's blaming you, they're likely to be deeply upset about something. And therefore, it's how you explore that upset. And as hypnotherapists, that hopefully that's what we're good at doing.
Okay, I've got one more question here. You were talking about how some patients find it difficult because they've never experienced that as in part of their life. So Nicola is asking, how would you address a client who cannot recall or relate to a compassionate role model during therapy? How would you address that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. I think you said it was Nicola. Look, obviously we all have the neural network in place to be compassionate. So therefore, it's helping the patient to understand what the qualities of compassion are, first of all, and then to imagine someone who might have those qualities. Then whether or not it's stepping into them, or whether it's that person or them stepping into that person, there are a whole host of very creative ways that as hypnotherapists, we can come up with to bypass what I would call our sort of natural self-imposed limitations. Why should someone know how to be compassionate if they don't have the upbringing of compassion? But that definitely doesn't mean they can't experience them, which I hope answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I think, yeah, that's about the questions. There's a lot of discussion, but as I said before, maybe we will be in touch with you because it has, yeah.
If anyone has any questions, please feel that you can contact me. And it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with all of you today.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.
Back to you, Tanusha.